Kalev. Heidi is ACA's Vice President of Government Affairs, and Heidi will tell us about today's presenter.
Thank you, Marcus. As always, we're thrilled to have the ChemQuest team with us today. Our primary presenter today is Bob Kramer. He is a director with the ChemQuest Group who supports clients in the firm's operational and manufacturing efficiencies business pillar. Bob joined ChemQuest in 2022 following a 40-year career in the polymer converting industry, where he developed extensive global experience in the operational management, driving enhanced business productivity and product development across corporate environments. Also with us is Edie Fox Abrams, ChemQuest Vice President of Business Development and Marketing. Edie has 25 years of experience in specialty chemicals and materials, has been a respected member of the ChemQuest executive leadership team since 2015. With market expertise and insight that is valued by numerous industry publications, trade organizations, and institutions, she supports ChemQuest's client base to generate growth and profitability. During our Q&A segment, we may also hear from ChemQuest Vice President Ray Glazier. Ray brings a strong background from global companies and technical leadership, operations, and business strategy to the team. His specialty lies in identifying value levers and developing strategies to improve profitability and drive growth. So Bob, Ray, Edie, thank you again for this series, or this seminar in the series, and I'm going to turn it over to you all.
Hi, everybody. I'm Edie Abrams. It's my pleasure to welcome you on behalf of the ChemQuest team to our third in a series of webinars. Hoping my dog doesn't bark too loud in the background, so bear with me here. Today's session, number 3 in our series, is regarding optimizing supply chain to increase the bottom line. And that's something that is obviously important to all of us, especially as we've come out of the COVID situation. Supply chain issues, as we know, have really been a nightmare throughout the coatings industry. Marcus, if we could advance to the next slide, please. Yes, so as I said, this is our third. We still have one more coming up, Tuesday, October 17th, Safety First, Best Practices in Environmental Health and Safety. So we look forward to seeing you then as well. Let's just hit the next slide with a brief comment about the ChemQuest Group. Hopefully most of you recognize us, certainly from the series of webinars, but also from our role within the coatings industry and as members of the ACA. You know, the ChemQuest Group is a global specialty chemicals consulting organization. We work with a lot of our clients to do what this tagline says: navigate the intersection of strategy, markets, operations, and technology. And we do that by working within the 4 pillars, one of which we're here to discuss today. But the main pillars of ChemQuest include business strategy and transformation, technology development through a series of independent labs, well, labs that we own for independent evaluation of materials and formulation and application. Through our work in M&A advisory services, where we work on both the buy side and sell side advisory help for companies that are either in the buying or selling mode. And lastly, in this area where we're going to discuss today, operational and manufacturing efficiencies. We have more than 130 team members, 48 of whom are PhD chemists. We all come from a background within the specialty chemicals industry, many of us directly in coatings, and typically our personnel have had long careers working in positions, some of which you guys are doing today, and we have reached that point in our career where we are able to specialize and work in a consulting role. So our extensive roster has senior managers from major manufacturers, business owners, senior technical managers. Everything we do revolves around a technology base. And from that standpoint, I'd like to just thank you for participating and listening. The recording will be available, and we hope that there is information here that will spur on further conversations with us at your convenience. I'd like to hand the floor over to Bob Kramer now.
Thank you, Edie. Marcus, can go to the next slide. So welcome everyone. Again, this is Bob Kramer, and today we're going to cover, this is part 3, as Edie had mentioned, on supply chain and looking for best practices and ways to make your business more profitable. We're going to cover a lot today, so bear with me. You know, it's my hope that there's going to be a lot of things that I'm sure you're fully aware of, some you're partially aware of, but a lot of old tools, but hopefully some new practices and new ways to use those tools. But we'll also, you know, pepper in some other more current trends that are going on in the market. But for the most part, the focus is going to be on the entire supply chain, starting from beginning to end. And the scope is really going to cover a lot on management commitments, ownership, a lot of tools that are involved that are both been used and can be used better. So this is just a list of all the things we're going to cover today, and we'll touch on those in depth as we go through the presentation. Next slide. So I think right off the bat, I cannot emphasize enough how really important it is for a successful supply chain to, number one, get management and senior management commitment at the top. It's critical that it's viewed not as just a purchasing function. A lot of times that's what people think of supply chain. They take the shortcut and go right to purchasing. We're going to look at this in a full cradle to grave concept. And to do that, you really need senior leadership's commitment and ownership. You also need to come out and invest in a good team. I'm a big believer that if we were to start this over, if you were starting a company, or even you want to look at it as starting a new organization, one of the first things you want to really do is build a strong team with a workforce in place that improves your reliability and cost effectiveness in supply. There's several things you can do there. I mean, cross-business execution, you want to break down those organizational silos. You want to be working across as well as up and down the organization. You want to be looking at standardized processes across your organization so that you're not having redundancy that tends to also be waste, it's error prone. You really want to voice the supply chain in your organization. You know, that goes beyond, again, just purchasing. It starts with you know, your production people, your sales team, your finance team, even HR to help build the team. You want to have a goal alignment with the company objectives. This should fit into your overall strategy, your supply chain. You want to innovate, and you want to focus on process improvements. You know, a continuous improvement environment should extend to all disciplines within a company, and supply chain is no different. And then obviously back to the HR side, you want to have employee training and development with a career focus, including other organizations. And what I mean by that is, you know, you don't have to be dead-ended in a career in supply chain just when you enter it. I think good companies that really promote their employee development look to supply chain as a great training ground to move into other areas within the organization, be it manufacturing, be it sales, and even you know, general management and beyond that. So it also you want to look at supply chain to better your demand cycle performance. We'll talk more about that in detail. You know, in the way you can look at this, it might be a little bit short-term costly when you're investing in a supply chain structure such as I'm talking about, but in the long run, you're going to have a more reliable, longer-term supply, and then hopefully a lower cost to go with that. And then I'm always a big proponent of customer service. This is how does the customer fit into our supply chain strategy? Because I'm a proponent, if we don't have customers, we don't have a business. And I want to tie that as well into our discussion today. But customer service is a key part of that, and how we handle our supply chain with our customers. Next slide. So a good way to look at what I'm talking about as far as commitment is making it proactive versus reactive. You know, what does that mean? So these are just some examples of what I would would highlight as far as being proactive versus reactive in your culture. You want to build strategic and robust partnerships with select customers and suppliers. It's both suppliers and customers. You want to develop the pricing strategy goes with that. You always want to use data for consistent supply chain planning and processes such as backlogs, consumer behavior information, demand forecasting. You get into overproduction, stockouts. These are all the events that happen, and that's why you really need to have good data. Production throughputs, inventory control, and working capital management, et cetera, et cetera. You also want to make sure you have a good procurement strategy. Your freight planning, both in and out of the business, is key, and you need to have a reliability upon that. And lastly, you really want to make sure you have contingency plans. Have you thought out those what ifs? What could go wrong that could disrupt the supply chain? These are the proactive things that you should be doing as a team, and again, having that driven from the top should give you that commitment that you're looking for. Next slide. So again, you make this continuation. There's a few things in addition you can do with being proactive. On a routine basis, you should really review the planning process, go over what's working. Are there errors that can be reduced or even eliminated? And even bias. Bias creeps in a lot on demand planning based on, customer favoritism, easy production runners. All these things come into play, and it's really important to look at the data to steer you towards the right, production and focus on the demand side. So you want to have your product life cycles also need to be a focal point. You want to reduce your product obsolescence. You don't want to have overproduction that's going to sit and then you end up having a costly write-off at some point. You want to acknowledge the impact on product development. You're going to only get this through good market intelligence and also talking to your customers. You want to know what customers are working on so that you can get ahead and you can plan your supply chain to really adapt to that forward thinking and those new products that are coming online so that you're not reacting back to that comment again. And then you always, as I mentioned before, create an environment of continuous improvement. I'm a big fan of the cross-functional planning across the entire organization. Do not work in silos if at all possible. Wherever you can, intertwine your supply chain with sales, which gives a lot of that good information on the front end. Finance, from a standpoint of helping you manage things such as working capital, inventory obsolescence, even collections come into play there from your customers, as well as payment terms coming from your suppliers. Operations, obviously, they've got to make the product. They've got to make it efficiently. They've got to make it with a high level of quality. So the more you can rely on those, what I'll call team members within your supply chain, the more effective you're going to be. Again, better alignments with customers. I can't emphasize enough how important it is. Listen to your customers. Make sure you understand what's important to them. We'll talk a lot about some of the important metrics and measurables that customers expect and want to see as well as we get further on down through the presentation. And then all of these, it goes without saying, if you're going to improve your earnings position, you're going to have to improve overall productivity. And this is something that every supply chain should be looking at as ways to get better so that they're going to have, a more efficient and add to the bottom line. Next slide. So let's look at some ways to use a diverse procurement supply chain with multi-sourcing, dual sourcing capabilities. Let's talk a little bit about sole sourcing. Sole sourcing isn't right for everybody, or it's right for certain segments of your business and not for others. So you really need to look at all the considerations that a sole sourcing situation can provide. It can help in some respects, but it can be high risk. So some of the things that I just would throw out there, the costs of sole sourcing, setups, cross-contamination, by moving to different suppliers in and out of the process. Do they have lot traceability? Is the supplier reliability with multiple production lines, and are they and facilities? Are they a one-stop shop that has maybe one plant with one line? You're leaving yourself pretty vulnerable if you're relying on a supplier that doesn't have any backup capacity in their own. They should be customer approved and a quality emergency alternate supply source. If you're going to go to a sole source and they can convince you that it's the right thing to do, you really want to challenge what is going to happen if something does go wrong. What are they going to do as their backup and show you and validate it? Sometimes it involves supplier packaging, delivery performance, how flexible are they and ease of doing business with. And then you want to have a distribution strategy as well for smaller commodity supplies to make sure if you're going to have sole sourcing that's going to come into play. What's the critical raw materials or services to your business? Is what happens if you're sole source and you can't get it anywhere else? What are you going to do about that? All these things all need to be considered, and obviously price is a given with and supply guarantee. These are things that you should consider. Next slide. So just to look at from a pros and cons and measurement, what are some of the sole sourcing versus multiple supplier decisions you need to make? Again, we mentioned some before. Some of the advantages: you can foster a long-term supply relationship. You get to know your suppliers, they get to know you. You get favorable pricing, hopefully, due to your volume commitments. If you're putting all your business in one basket, you should get rewarded for that risk that you're taking, and the supplier should reward you for lower pricing. But you're also going to have, again, reduced administrative costs. If you're dealing with one supplier, you're not having multiple transactions with outsiders. Those can add up and add money. But again, those are the things only you can consider with your business and what's the right thing to do. Some of the disadvantages: what happens if you're sole source and you have a supply disruption? What are you going to do? You definitely will have, even though you should be getting favorable pricing. If you're only using one supplier and that supplier knows that, you're going to have less price leverage, and it's not going to help in your negotiations. And then supplier complacency. What happens if there's a change in a supplier? It could be a change in leadership. It can be a change in ownership. All these things can change what you might have been accustomed to having strong performance for years or for months, whatever, just change in a heartbeat. You better be ready for what that's going to mean and what your backup plan is going to be. I would say, from my experience, and probably for most of you, most organizations take a hybrid approach that combines really the best of both worlds, that gives a little bit of both. There's certain places where sole sourcing applies, but there's also certain places where multi-sourcing supplies. So that's a unique decision that each of your organizations and your business has to make. Next slide. So another thing that I think is important is setting expectations and developing standards in your supply chain. I personally believe I'm a big transparency person, and I believe in organizations having full supply chain visibility. That goes both with your customers as well as with your suppliers. Hopefully your customers will recognize that the more that they can share with you as far as their business goes, and I'm not talking about confidential proprietary things, but more they can share with you about their business and you can align yourself and learn that, the better you're going to be able to supply them by knowing what their demands are, what their trigger points are in their business. So it's important that you have good visibility, and that's going to come from the organization working very hard, getting deeper into a customer's organization to figure that out. You want to really promote information sharing in your partnerships, both again with your suppliers, with your customers, but also internally. That whole supply chain is not just outside or inside. It's starting from beginning with customer and then to the supplier and into the internal side of making sure there's no weak links in the chain. So the other thing is important is making sure there's compliance and regulatory and corporate values. These are very important. Make sure you're communicating, ensuring adherence to your expectations with your supplier network. You don't want to be aligned with a supplier who thinks differently or doesn't take this serious when it comes to regulatory or compliance issues. You could possibly be pulled into a negative view of the marketplace if you are aligned with what I'll call an unfavorable supplier. You want to have regular and random audits or inspections. You want to kind of, okay, show me what you do. I trust but verify. Take a look at through audits and inspections to make sure that there's nothing hidden that you just can't see on the surface. And then I think partner with suppliers on compliance while holding them accountable. I mean, that goes without saying. The accountability piece of all the metrics that are important, but also making sure they're good stewards in the business that you're part of as well. Next slide. So we want to align our behaviors and corporate governance and actions with suppliers, and I really want to emphasize the actions with suppliers. You really want to be looking at a culture in your supply chain where they're following ethical labor practices and practicing what you preach. If you're going to ask them to do these things, you want to make sure you're doing them as well. So these are things that enhance or make the supply chain even more robust. You want to promote code of conduct and ethics toward employees. Again, being good, good company citizens is towards your employees and towards the suppliers and customers, employees as well. Transparency without cover up or criminal behavior. Hopefully that's not something you've experienced, but there are times when you will see some things go wrong with a company's brand or hide something and it becomes criminal. What are you going to do if that happens? You want to make sure you're positioned. And then communicate the desire for an eco-friendly policies. Promote the 3 R's, philosophy, where you reduce, you reuse, you recycle. These are all waste elimination, promotion type things, but they're also good corporate governance as well that you want to promote. You want to promote a culture that helps to reduce the supplier's carbon footprint. Many of you are aware sometimes, and I don't know if some of your cultures have this in place, but there are RFQs that are being done, and carbon footprint and the measurement of a carbon footprint is if not a key measurement for some quotations and RFQs being accepted, but they can be a tiebreaker or a differentiator, I would say, if you can show that all things being equal, your carbon footprint and maybe your supply chain's carbon footprint is favorable. That might give you a competitive advantage against another company or companies if you stress that and it's built into your supply chain. Next slide. So let's talk also about transportation and warehouse strategy. Part of the supply chain is getting product in and out of your business. Part of that starts with your freight carriers. And I would say that you could take a look at both internal and external in that view. I'm looking more from a longer term view rather than transactional. You may split that up a little bit where you're less strategic materials. You can do more on a transactional base and pretty much you have plenty of choices on the outside to do that. But if it becomes a strategic raw material or a strategic finished good that is going to your customer, you really want to make sure you have reliable freight service and you should take actions. If it's international, you want to take a look at against high risk environments such as geopolitical environments. What's going on around the world today, you've got to be very careful about getting too tight with one region, and unless that's your only choice. And you should, if it is your only choice, you'd be always looking at other ways to look at other options. It's also the disruptions from flooding, hurricanes. All those things are important and can really harm your freight delivery if in if it be ground freight, it be by ship, whatever. So I like to see companies take a look at investing in an internal freight solution and calculating ROI for validation. There might be some situations where the reliability of your external freight solutions isn't viable enough. Maybe you look at maybe having a truck or a truck or two that is dedicated just in case. It's again back to that risk mitigation where you have a freight solution internally. Yes, it's going to add some costs sometimes, but if you can, if it's worth it to do that to secure the business that you need, it may not be a bad consideration. So I encourage taking a look at that on occasion. What's the right, way to handle that? Warehousing, very similar by looking at it from both an external and an internal point of view. I think it's the potential is, you can, to have strategic alliances with customers based on their location. It might be a requirement. Customers may require you to have, storage nearby them because they can't rely on the freight traffic or the distance between the time it takes from point A to point B. So these are all the kind of things that you want to look at. And I encourage looking at it, both ownership of warehousing yourself, as well as aligning yourself with with the outside world. Next slide. So another really important component of the supply chain is inventory. And, I like to look at it, if you look at it from the business side of it, you really are seeking an optimal balance. And that balance word to me is the key. You can't go one side. If you go too far on one side, for example, working capital, where you are running so tight on minimizing inventory, and yes, inventory waste can be a waste if it's excessive. But if you get so lean and you have any disruption and you have no backup, you're going to win the working capital balance, but you're going to lose the service, your customer service side, and that could be critical, and you could lose a customer. On the flip side, you also don't want to, what I'll call, say, get so heavy as far as overproduction and over inventorying, where you have the product available, but you're really sitting on a lot of money that's tied up that doesn't need to be. So you're seeking that balance, and that's why you really want to work closely with your finance team, your management team, that all the experts are in a room together, and you're trying to seek and get to that happy medium. So the other thing I would say in there's seasonal patterns. Don't just average your typical 12-month usages. You really need to look at seasonality in your business, and I'm sure most of you are doing that. But that is something that can really bite you if you don't look at what's happening with seasonality. Consignment programs, stock plans. They are all things that are important, but they need to be paid attention to. They are sometimes, again, needed to attain and retain customer business, but you want to make sure they're being done right, and that there's not, again, back to the obsolescence. You don't want to have a customer say, "Oh, put this on the floor for me, I'll take it," have nothing in writing, and then you get down to the customer's business goes away, and they're saying, "Well, I don't have anything in writing, so you're going to have to eat that stock." I thoroughly think having those alignments with your customers where it's kind of a take or pay, but you got to sell that. And in those cases, if it's a win for the customer, they'll be agreeable to that. Use blanket orders, help streamline the supply process. If you're buying, say, a commodity over and over again, why go through constantly? Just do a requisition and a release against a blanket. It's the same transaction. These are all things that can help you streamline and make your business more efficient. And then big, again, back to that product obsolescence, requires timely and intense attention to avoid costly write-offs. I've seen businesses, I've been involved in businesses. As a matter of fact, early in my career, I had a situation where I walked into a business and we showed a balance sheet that was quite high in inventory. And once we took a look at what was really in there, it took somebody new to come in and look at this, but this balance sheet was carrying inventory for well over several years of the same product. It was not moving. Today, it's a little less where that occurs, because I think there are, accounting policies and GAAP policies that require, write downs on periodic levels just to avoid that potential. But you don't want to get caught off guard with a business that's been sitting on all this inventory with the mindset that it's going to get used one of these days. Best not to make it in the first place if you can, but if you do, you really want to make sure all your internal stakeholders are on top of it. You don't want to hit management with a big surprise, with an obsolete write-off if you can possibly pretend it. All these things that I'm mentioning are things that you should be looking at to minimize, hits to your bottom line. Next slide. So you want to optimize your inventory management in tandem with demand forecasting. Coming from a production background, I've seen a lot of situations where I would say there's not the right balance in the organization as far as who's doing what. For example, in production could have too much scheduling power and they're not in line with supply chain. They can carry a lot of weight. What I mean by that is where it's not optimal, production-friendly products that allow production goals to be met, but are not necessary for the right action. Yeah, this might sound a little crazy, but I've seen organizations that put so much emphasis on production throughputs and production improvement that they don't run the right products that are marketable. And what happens is, for example, they may get a long campaign for a product that's very cost friendly from a yield standpoint, but now you're sitting on inventory that's it offsets 10 times what the gains you got from your yield improvement or your productivity output. You really want to make sure that your production goals are checked in there, they coincide or are aligned with your supply chain goals. And I would say planning and scheduling, that should be an independent role to the production. Yes, they should be working hand in hand with production to get the most efficiency. But I would say that if they're not having some independence on what is to be scheduled based on demand, then you've got potential for a problem. Look for that equilibrium to marry that service level to production efficiencies. And then going in line with that, same thing would be ensure that overproduction is addressed with proper metrics in place to monitor. We'll talk later in this presentation a lot about what are some of the key metrics to measure to reduce or avoid some of these things, but you can never put enough emphasis on putting the right metrics in place that everybody's visible to and is acting on. Next slide. So a big part of a successful supply chain is risk mitigation. There's so many things that can go wrong in a supply chain. There's so many things can go right if you're proactive. Back to our original comments on being proactive and looking forward thinking rather than in the rearview mirror and reactive thinking. What are some of the things that can happen if you're not on top of them? You're going to have potential for raw material shortages. Overplaying a just-in-time strategy. I say that because I've seen it happen many times where a just-in-time strategy is great when it's working 100% of the time, but when it doesn't work and there's a link in the chain, it's sometimes very difficult to get that back. Nothing wrong with the philosophy and doing everything you can, but you better be thinking about the downside. Supplier bankruptcies can come into play, natural disasters, trade disputes, theft, port and trucking disruptions, cybersecurity laws, regulation nonconformance, pandemics such as COVID-19. Who saw that coming a few years ago? That created tremendous reaction to, and again, it was a reaction in a lot of cases. Many companies were not able to weather that storm because they could not get supply. And part of it is because, maybe no fault of their own, but a lot of it could have maybe prevented. But it's been such a long time and maybe ever that we saw anything such as the pandemic with the supply chain disruption that it can make or break your company. And then there's also policies out there like the Inflation Reduction Act that are being legislated by the current administration to come into play. You know, things for like electric trucks, renewable energy, promotion of domestic sourcing. What's that going to do to the future of the supply chain that we were not accustomed to in the past? These are all the things that you should be building in and thinking about in your risk mitigation plan. Next slide. So, like most companies, I would say, but you know, I'm sure some of you or most of you probably have ERP working in your you know, your supply chain environment. And I say software, it doesn't necessarily have to be software. It could also be done manually if you're a small company and software is just cost prohibitive. But it is something that is highly encouraged. It gives you the information to run your department and even your business. I'm not going to get into all the details, but things such as demand forecasting, your deliveries, purchase orders, inventory control, MRP, your planning, scheduling processes, and real-time reporting on metrics and KPIs. A good ERP should give you all of those tools. The key is to use them and to really act on them accordingly. So I would encourage a strong ERP, and again, one that is, you know, cross-functional between the other departments. Next slide. So let's talk a little bit about some benchmarking and the use of KPIs to reach the optimum performance. I am a big proponent of you know, measurements and having tools in place and good tools to make sure that you're looking at those and measuring them and taking action. So you really want to prioritize your supply chain metrics that deliver the optimum performance and tracking the right metrics in the right amount. I couldn't stress enough how important it is. I've been involved in companies that I entered into where when I asked for their metrics and KPIs, both for supply chain, but really overall, I had one company that I worked for, I came in and they were tracking over 100 KPIs. And the key thing is they were tracking them. My questions were, what were they doing with them? My view is they were doing very little, and they were also had way too many. My theory would be take the right KPIs and the right metrics, maybe a handful. In supply chain, maybe that's 5 to 10 max, and make sure that they're the ones that will give you the benefit at the end of the day, and they're the ones that are going to drive your business performance. And the other thing is, don't just track them, do stuff with them. Make sure there are actions behind the numbers that come out. Otherwise, it's just a tracking system that's, quite frankly, I would call it a waste if all you're doing is tracking and not doing anything to improve. Out of that, you want to prioritize your activities, again, similar to what I just said, that they're going to drive your best outcomes. Developing, utilizing effective reporting, scorecards, measure your performance. Is the right people, are the right people getting the right information to make the right decisions? Do you have those effective reporting and scorecards in place? It also applies not only to your internals, to your suppliers, as well as to your customers. You want to be able to go back to your customers and show them that these things that are important to them, you're tracking and you've got a robust system in place. You want to benchmark, obviously, against yourself. That's back to the continuous improvement, but also the outside and possibly even the competition. You can get those kind of benchmarks to make sure, you know, you're in the leadership role that you want to be in from a supply chain standpoint. And then I'm sure the typical cost management, you're comparing your cost year on year against budget, against forecast. These are all the things that I highly recommend being done within your performance and your you know, you're optimizing your bottom line performance. Next slide. So what are a couple good supply chain KPIs to consider? There's numerous ones. Back to the before where I said you could have a high rate. My suggestion would be back to what I said, 5 to 10. Here's just a good standard list of KPIs that you could consider if you're not already using them, or if you're using them, if you're not using them in the way that maybe you're getting the the optimum performance, but the perfect order. This is kind of back to that customer satisfaction metric that I want to discuss. As discussed before, driving customer satisfaction and maybe a benchmark against your competition. Defect product quality, the drop air-free documentation. Are you invoicing correctly? Are your bills of lading? All the documentation a customer would see that comes to them. How are you doing, and measure that so that you're always improving. Your customer order cycle time. I'm not going to go into all the details on every one of these, but you can see cash to cash cycle time, number of days, fill rate, how successful you were as a percentage of first pass to your customer, days outstanding. That's a collection and a working capital metric, inventory turnover, another metric to manage how well you're servicing and how well you're managing your overall cash management. And then your inventory philosophy, same thing. These are all what I would consider, nameplate type KPIs to consider. This is for me, it's very important that the customer be a big part of this. Going back to my earlier comments about without the customer, we have no business. I remember earlier in my career as a general manager, I'll kind of end on this story and we'll move on. But I went into an organization as a general manager. This was probably in the early 2000s. And one of the first things I do when I get into a new leadership role with the support of ownership is to take the first 100 days and come up with a blueprint of what I want to accomplish. And a big part of that blueprint is to get an understanding of what is the customer thinking about our performance and where we stand from their eyes. So what I did was I spent a lot of time in that first 100 days visiting many of the customers, especially all the key customers. I also talked to my senior managers and senior direct reports, as well as random shop floor and just about anybody that'll listen. And I'm going to and not only listen, but also pick their brain on their ideas. I'm going to get as much information on that organization as I can. One of the organizations that I found was we just did not know who the customer was. And, I got that from the customer, but I also got that from a sense of where we were internally. And a big part of that was we didn't view our supply chain strategically. And when I would ask my team and kind of challenge them, what do you think about this regarding the supply chain? In the most cases, they said, this is a sales problem. We don't have the top line growth because our sales team's not delivering, et cetera, et cetera. What they didn't understand is they are a key and integral part to the customer and not just sales. And I actually had a book that they had required to read called The Customer Driven Company, Moving from Talk to Action. This was a requirement for all my direct reports to go and look at. And it's interesting. Most of the members, not all, came back and said, that was really an interesting point. I never really understood what you meant by a customer-driven company. And by reading that book and you continuing to promote many of these supply chain activities, they understood their role to customer satisfaction, not from a sales standpoint, but also from a pure overall value that each and every member brings to the organization and to the customer satisfaction. So it's kind of a pet of mine, pet project of mine, and definitely something that I'm very high proponent in all my interactions when talking with clients and with customers and with anyone who will listen, that this is a key part. If you really want to drive customer satisfaction, these are the kind of things that will surely make you better, but maybe even step you apart from the competition. So that's next slide. I want to mark it. Okay, that's the concludes the presentation today. I want to thank everyone for joining and listening, and hopefully you get some ideas on some, like I said earlier, some best practices that maybe you can kind of make even better than what you were already doing in areas that you've been doing for years, or maybe you even got a couple fresh eyes. And I hope that is the outcome of today's session. So thank you all very much. I think now we're going to take some questions that we might have. Marcus, you want to take over?
Yep, we'll go into Q&A. How do I contend with unexpected supply tightness in a key raw material like VAM?
Okay. Hey, Ray, you're the expert in that field. I'm going to turn that one over to you. You want to handle that question?
Well, yeah, I'd be happy to take a shot at VAM. As many of you know, it gets tight. If that's your key raw material, what are you going to do if the market's tight? Some of that gets back to what Bob was saying throughout the presentation. When the market's tight, it's kind of too late to do much about it. You're kind of stuck with whatever situation you put yourself into. The time to deal with that really is before it becomes a problem. Identifying VAM in particular or any other raw material that's critical to your operation as a potential pinch point and setting up either stock or being, having a strategic relationship with a key supplier if you're large enough. If you're a smaller customer, you don't buy enough volume where you have leverage. Maybe it is setting up key stock somewhere, or at least have a contingency plan for something like that. That does periodically get tight. People that successfully navigate those things have anticipated it. People that are kind of stuck haven't. So that'd be my recommendation. Just think about it ahead of time and identify those potential pinch points and put plans in place.
All right, we'll move to the next one. Is it better to split the buy of small volume critical raw materials across suppliers for security of supply and take a hit on price, or aggregate volume to get the best deal? Is there a way to secure supply and get the best deal?
I think I spoke about that in the presentation to some level, more a kind of a macro view, but maybe Ray, you can shed some highlights of that because you're working a little closer with some clients in that regard.
Well, again, I mean, it's almost it's a similar kind of discussion. If you've identified raw materials that are going to be critical to you, Bob mentioned you could be sole sourced with a particular supplier. If you've got a very close relationship with them, then you can have plans in place, contingency plans if that gets tight. If it's a strategic relationship and you're a strategic customer, you're less likely to be negatively affected or affected less. On the other hand, if it's a material that can be purchased from a number of different sources, it might be a smart thing to do to have a secondary source qualified. You don't necessarily have to split it evenly. You might be able to get a second source who's willing to take only 20% of your demand or 10%, but you pay them a premium to have them there as an emergency backstop. So those are a couple of approaches. Again, like what I said earlier, if you haven't thought about it before you have the problem, it's kind of hard to deal with it when the problem comes up and bites you.
Good.
All right. For critical raw materials bought through distribution, is it better or safer to buy from the big guys versus a smaller regional distributor?
So I think this is going to be a case by case basis based on the business itself and what the offerings are. But again, I covered that in some detail. But Ray, what are your thoughts on that subject?
It depends on who you're who you're getting your supply from. If you're a large buyer of a lot of things and you have a critical raw material that you don't buy a lot of, maybe you're better off with the bigger supplier. They may have better sourcing position on a critical raw material. If you're a smaller buyer, you might want to look at who is supplying you, and if you like a smaller regional distributor because they can service you better, or split their volumes down or better on the day-to-day service, then maybe you'd want to consider putting key stock aside, or identifying an alternate source. But again, if you don't buy a lot of it, that kind of It's, to Bob's point, it's going to be a case by case, but there are ways to deal with it depending on your particular situation.
Yeah.
Bear with me just a second here.
No, I'd add
Right.
into that last question, if you don't mind me chiming in, from the perspective of a smaller manufacturer. I think that a lot of the consideration goes back to how you treat that supplier as well, right? From the small company, I used to be the co-owner of a smaller manufacturing company. If you treat your supplier with respect, you pay your bills on time, you know, treat them properly, you will find that you get excellent treatment back. And it doesn't really matter whether it's the bigger or the smaller of your suppliers. But a lot of everything we're talking about is a dual respect relationship.
Great. Thanks, Edie.
All right. How do you handle carrier delays?
So from my standpoint, I think it gets back to that performance discussion. You know, I'm not a big proponent. If they've had a good track record previously and there's something going on, it's coming back to that openness and transparency. If you can tell me what's really going on and you've got a desire and a plan to fix it, we'll work with you. And that's how I would approach it, especially if they were a long-term, reliable, you know, supplier to me. I surely just don't want to throw them out. Things don't necessarily or automatically get better by getting rid of somebody or a vendor. I'd much prefer taking the approach of how do we make you get back on track and take it from there. Ray, Edie, you have any other things you want to add to that?
No, I'll just build on something Edie just said. I think if you know you have a problem coming, as soon as you have that problem, you may want to reach out to your customer and say, hey, I've got this issue. Is there a way we can kind of navigate it together? And I think if you handle those kinds of situations well, you wind up building stronger relationships with both your customer and potentially also your supplier.
I'd say if you're really experiencing a delay and you need to get material, be creative. I hope I'm not speaking out of tune here, but I recall situations where we would rent a truck and we would go meet the truck wherever it may have broken down or gotten stuck, you know, and brought the material to our factory or to any one of the locations, even to a job site on occasion if it was something that, you know, could be used directly on a job site, and help out in that way. So don't put it all on the carrier. Things do happen from time to time. Step in and help them if they've, again, been good to you in the past. Treat them the same way.
Great point. Yeah, I think that comes back into that customer, you know, responsiveness and really making sure they realize you're doing everything possible. And if it requires getting a raw material to do that, to get the customer their shipment, those are the things we got to do, think outside the box sometimes. And that's where I would say, what I was talking about, an internal strategy versus an external strategy. Don't put all your eggs, look at both, you know, a hybrid approach to making sure you're mitigating that risk.
You know, the whole interesting thing about this conversation is when you talk about supply chain, we can look at it from the fact that we are part of the supply chain in terms of, you know, as a manufacturer of something, but also in that we are being supplied. So again, it's understanding both sides of the relationship. I think that this conversation is so helpful, of course, for the supply chain personnel, but it's also helpful to hear this from for the sales personnel, for the management personnel, so they understand these challenges and how they're faced. Because typically, you know, depending on where you are in the value chain, you're still part of a supply chain, either being supplied to or supplying to.
Good point. Yeah.
All right. Next one. Will a co-op give better security of supply?
Ray, you want to take that one? You probably work co-ops more than I have specifically, being in my role.
Well, I'll give a comment, and I think Edie's got something to share on that one as well. I think it depends on the co-op, and it depends on the material. And clearly, you know, most of the people on the call in the coatings world, you've got a pretty complex mix of raw materials that you probably source. So, yeah, if it's some esoteric material and your co-op may not have a lot of participants using that, they may not be a great place to go. On the other hand, if it's esoteric for you, but the co-op's got a number of participants that they use a lot of that particular raw material, that may be a great place to backstop and make your surety of supply. Edie, would you care to comment?
A co-op can be very helpful, especially if it's supportive in nature and you're willing to help others the same way that you look for them to help you. I think that it can absolutely bring value, and I know there are a number of very effective co-ops in the coatings community.
All right. With the passing of the Inflation Reduction Act of 2022 by the Biden administration, has there been increased activity related to onshoring more capacity to the United States?
Yeah, I've been doing a fair amount of research and talking to several people about how they're responding to that. And there's a couple of different approaches people are taking. One would be, back to the risk situation and the uncertainty in overall global situation and supply. There is, in some camps, a lot of interest in bringing production back and domestic production back, which is part of what that Inflation Reduction Act is, but it's also driven a lot by green and energy. And if you think about the other side with, and I mentioned it just briefly in the presentation, a big push towards the electric vehicles and how that's going to impact, your shipping. I mean, right now, I'm not an expert in this field, but when you hear that a truck can go 2,000 miles on gasoline or diesel, and it's now going to go 300 miles on electric, that's going to have a major disruption if it's not addressed, and assuming those numbers are correct on the supply chain as this goes forward. So yes, there's a lot of activity in that area where people are trying to look at what's the right thing to do. They're also looking at it as what happens if the next administration comes in and changes it back or changes it to something else. How's that going to impact if I go out and invest all this money? So there's so many things to consider, cost being a big part of it, in the uncertainty of what the future is going to hold based on, just the whole geopolitical situation. But that's kind of my take on what I'm seeing. Anybody else have any comments on what they're seeing? Ray or Edie, anything?
I would add that I think some of that onshoring was happening. The COVID shock to the supply chain made everybody rethink how they're getting supplied. And I think even just some of the just general market demands for more user specific, more custom, people were looking at their supply chain, say, well, that extends to my product design life cycle too. And if I got a supply chain that reaches, let's say, to the lowest cost region in the globe, but that, puts a 6-month window on design and adds, to my product design cycle, I think people were rethinking that even beforehand. So all these factors, COVID certainly was a trigger point. The Inflation Reduction Act, I think, just maybe adds to it as well, as Bob pointed out. But I think there is going to be a wave of onshoring for production, and that would mean more demand and potentially more raw materials also being produced in our continent.
Yeah.
I suggest following a gentleman by the name of Harry Moser, who has the Reshoring Initiative. He's got a lot of good information. He stays very current on what's going on in terms of reshoring of general industry in the U.S. and nearshoring with operations in Mexico.
All right, so we're at the top of the hour. I want to check in with Heidi and see if you had anything to add at this point.
There's some excellent questions there. I don't think I have anything to add. Just my thanks again to the A team at ChemQuest.
Yes, thanks to the A team.
Thanks to you, Bob. You're the one who pulls most of this together.
Thank you.
Great
No
info.
problem. Greatly appreciated it. Thanks, everybody.
See you in a couple weeks.
Okay.
And just quickly for folks still on the line, I will distribute the slides this afternoon, and the recording will be available on paint.org in probably the next 24 hours or so. A couple of upcoming webinars. We're having our state affairs update for California. This will be September 26th at 2 o'clock in the afternoon. Don't want to miss that. And on October the 12th, we'll have fundamentals of paint radiative properties, what they are, why they matter, and how they are evaluated. This will be led by Audrey Miguel, project manager at the Cool Roof Coatings Council. And on October 17th at 1 p.m., the A team from ChemQuest will be right back here to present Safety First, Best Practices in Environmental Health and Safety. You can always go to paint.org in the member center and register for these webinars as they become available. Have a good afternoon, everyone.
Thanks, Marcus. Bye, everyone.
All right, thank you.